Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will start very shortly. I'm just waiting for people to log in. Perfect. So hello and welcome to today's live from the studio with Kyla Gilbert. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Fauni Barra, and I am the Public Programming and Residency Coordinator here at Griffin Art Projects. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that our work takes place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Sţălău nations, to whom we are deeply grateful. As well, we would like to thank BC Arts Council for their support of the residency program. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. If you would like to see live captions displayed for today's presentations, you can enable these by selecting the CC Live Transcription button at the bottom of your screen. At the end of today's presentation, there will be time for audience questions. So if at any point during the presentation you feel like you have a question to ask, please feel free to type it on the Q&A dialog box. Without further ado, I will introduce Kyla Gilbert. Kyla Gilbert is a visual artist based out of Vancouver BC on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. She graduated with a BFA in performance from Concordia University in 2017 and spent the 2 subsequent years touring as a puppeteer with DJ Koala. During her time as a puppeteer, she became interested in the inherent animacy of objects. Her current practice revolves around chance encounter with found objects, which she combines with the structure elements made from industrial materials. Through her sculptural pieces, she considers the importance of mutual support and the moments of pleasure, absurdity, and messiness that can be found in material relationships. Kyla completed her MFA in Studio Art from Emily Carr University in the spring of 2022. So take it away, Kyla.
Hi, thank you, Fauni. So I'm going to share my screen now. All right. All right, so hello everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Kyla Gilbert and I'm the current Emily Carr Artist in Residence at the Griffin Art Projects. I'm currently in my studio, as you can see from the sculpture that's on the screen and also behind me. And I am currently on the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Sälilwətaḻ nations. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about my background and interests and what brought me into the Griffin, and then transition to how that's changed since I've been here. So I have a background as a puppeteer, and this is the show that I toured with the longest. It's called Newphonia Must Fall, and it was created by DJ Kid Koala. And it is a slightly more than an hour-long black and white film that is filmed live on stage. So we'd have sets on the stage and puppets, a cinematographer and an editor who would live edit the things that were being shot, and a string quartet providing a soundtrack, and then 3 puppeteers who in this photo are hidden under the set on the right, as puppeteers often are. And I really loved working with objects and building objects. And so I started to transition out of performance and into visual art and sculpture. And coming from a background where I was trying to animate objects, I felt like the work that I was creating and continues to make is quite animate. And although it doesn't explicitly deal with bodies, there is a sense of corporeality to it. I'm often using or creating objects that have kind of an organic feel, or are these singular entities that have some sort of activation or energy. And starting my master's at Emily Carr, I initially was working with a lot of found materials and was really interested in synthetics, partly because there just are so many synthetics. And I particularly liked things that were trying to be other things. So a wood veneer on particle board, or in the case of this piece, a piece of PVC leather that I'd peeled or skinned. I continue to work with found, often synthetic objects and materials, but I wanted to change their context. And so I would take apart the objects and then use the materials within them to create something new. And I also started to allow myself to introduce things that I'd made, like this metal grid in the photo on the left, and to also introduce my own fakes. So I started covering foam in a thin layer of mortar to make it look like concrete, and then placing those pieces into the assemblages that I was making. At this point, I decided to introduce a little bit of color, and I did this to counteract some of the self-seriousness and dourness that I was finding was creeping into my work accidentally. And this was happening because I was working with a lot of big, gray, brown things that could be like really draggy. And that wasn't what I wanted. My intention was to create things that were a bit more whimsical and had levity and were surprising. And so adding color helped to sort of displace the way that they were being viewed. And adding color really freed me up to work in different ways, and to not have to abide by kind of the rules of logic in a way. Using color felt like quite a risk to me, because the justification for it is really only my own intuition. I have a feeling that a certain color will work with a certain piece, but I can't really justify why. And so there's the potential for surprise within that, which is really exciting, and also the potential for failure. So I had to create a situation in which it was okay for me to fail. And giving myself that freedom to fail was really helpful in then creating pieces that could develop more organically, and that kind of relied on failure in a way. Like this piece, for instance, I had initially cast the rebar in the plaster, and then I didn't like it, so I split it apart and really liked the mark that had been left in the plaster. And then the wooden structure was part of a bigger structure initially, but I liked it on its own, and it wasn't stable. So I needed to anchor it to the wall with the metal pieces. And then the bicycle tube, I had painted pink as a test that I didn't like, but then did like in this context. And the bicycle tube itself, I had collected a bunch of them because I was inspired by this tube that I had found in a construction site behind Emily Carr. And so all of these sculptures were dealing with balance and reliant on balance. And this idea of what I called imperfect support. So with all of these pieces, because they were found, I was going out into my community to find them, and I often needed help from people because they were quite big and hard to move. And I was thinking a lot about how communities rely on mutual support, but because we're also different, that can be a little bit hodgepodge. There can be like a little bit of grinding at different places. And so we are there for each other, but it's never going to be totally perfect or exactly what any one of us needs. So with these sculptures, they're precarious, but they're not threatening. So they might sag a bit, or they might look like they're going to fall, but they're not going to. They are being supported, even if it's in a slightly droopy way. And after finishing this set of pieces that I made for my MFA thesis show, I then did another small show at a friend's space in collaboration with another artist. And for this show, I created an audio tour of sculptures that you couldn't see. And I was initially really excited about this idea because it allowed me to be super expansive and really use my imagination without having any material constraints, which is really exciting after making a lot of big material work. But what I found in creating this experience is that it actually became more about free will, because I, in creating the audio file and having also made the sculptures, had a very particular way of interacting with them. And a viewer then, in listening and following my instructions in navigating the space, had to see the sculptures in the way that I saw them and notice the details that I noticed and stay with the sculptures for the amount of time that I prescribed. So they, in fact, had very little agency in how they were moving around the space. And what I realized is that it had actually become a bit of a performance in which the audio file was a script and the viewer was actually a performer and was standing in some ways, for me, the original writer of the piece. So then in July, I started the residency at the Griffin. And in entering into the residency, I'd been thinking a lot about this kind of accidental athleticism that had somehow made its way into my process and subsequently into my work. And what I mean by that is that I'm a sculptor and I don't have a car. And so when I was at Emily Carr, in order to get materials to my studio, I'd have to lug them back in a small cart from Home Depot, or carry pieces of concrete from the construction site behind the school one by one into my studio, or carry an 8x8 foot metal armature up 4 flights of stairs because it wouldn't fit in the elevator. And I really loved doing this. I liked putting myself in kind of oddball situations in which I'd get a lot of looks. But I realized that, one, I was pretty physically tired. And then also I had this kind of fear and disdain for any softness or weakness that I perceived in myself. And so I thought this was an important thing to explore. And I feel like I have been doing that at the studio, but it was undercut by the fact that I don't have a car and the studio is in North Van and I live in South Mount Pleasant. So I've been going on some pretty epic bike rides. And these are some photos of things that I see on my route every time I come or go from the studio that have inspired me in some ways, I think. Especially this one. This is a view I really love. There's a parking lot on top of the building, which I find really absurd for some reason. So starting at the Griffin, my initial idea had been to reintroduce mold making into my practice. I was inspired by a mold making in textiles class that I had just taught at Emily Carr. And I got into the studio and realized that there was nothing really that I wanted to mold and cast. But I had these old casts that I'd made of a rock and a banana wrapped in plastic wrap. And so I placed them in these mysterious metal containers that I got from Urban Repurpose, which is close by and really great. And I don't know what I'm going to do with those yet, but they are here. And then I just started working by texture. So my immediate impulse was to just cover everything in plaster wrap. So I got foam and I covered it in plaster wrap, and I got dowel and I covered it in plaster wrap. And I got more dowel and covered it in burlap dipped in plaster. And it just felt really good, like in my hands, to make very soft. And the other thing that I had wanted to explore coming into the Griffin was color, because up until that point, I'd been using spray paint that I found from Home Depot, which is kind of more of a found color. And I was interested in what would happen if I had more of a hand in the color that I was using, and tried out different colorants to see how they would affect materials in different ways. So I started coloring the plaster with watercolor and then putting acrylic on canvas. I also got some oil sticks and some powder pigments. And then I had this wire lying around my studio and made a form with it, and had this idea of making mobiles. And I really love negative space, and I love how objects and color pop against negative space or create these kind of shapes out of nothing. And so I was really excited about combining these pieces that I created with the found color of the rope. And I think about these pieces as bodies in a way. They're made up of disparate parts, but the wire gives them an outline. And the other thing that I'd been thinking about in making these was the idea of time, and how in any given moment, there are wonderful things and terrible things and really mediocre things, all happening at the same time. And also about how life can be really chaotic. And I moved during the time of the residency, so life has been pretty chaotic. But that if you're able to kind of hold all of that and just let it be the way it is, that can be really joyous and beautiful. I've been making various sizes of mobiles. This is a slightly smaller one. And then I made one that sits on the floor. It's got a thicker gauge of wire, so it's heavier. And another thing that I was thinking about while making these was those colored bead and wire games that toddlers have, where you move the beads. But I think that's more in the making than what comes across at the end. And I've also been working on some other things while I'm at the studio. The burlap dowel pieces that I talked about before, my plan is to color them and then string them together with wire and have them balancing in the space. And that the foam I've been using as kind of a surface to paint and scratching away at layers of paint to create these paintings. So overall, I've really enjoyed being in this space throughout the summer. It's been bright and sunny and cool inside because of the air conditioning. And it's just been such a pleasure to come here and make things that feel pleasurable to make and are really light and colorful and joyous. And I'm really excited to continue making things here. So thank you to everyone at the Griffin for the opportunity. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm gonna stop sharing. Great.
Hey, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, Kyla.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really nice to hear about what you have been up to during your time at Griffin. And so we're open for questions from the audience. If you want to ask anything to Kyla, you can either type it on the chat or in the Q&A dialog box, and I'll read the question out loud. But to get things started, maybe I'll ask you about, you were talking about the imperfect support that you had for your sculptures at Emily Carr in your graduation show. And then when you're making the mobiles, I also think of like an imperfect support. How do you see the connections there?
I think there definitely is. I would say that is an analogous, there's definitely still support happening and balance, but these feel kind of more, they're both more disparate and more self-contained. Like I think the work I was making in the past was often reliant against like two things sort of balancing each other, two individuals, whereas these are kind of like one individual, but made up of these small kind of crystallized moments. So there's kind of unification, and you can just sort of watch all of the elements kind of twist and move.
Yeah, because also you change from using the walls for support to the ceiling.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a quick tour of your studio?
Sure, yeah. It's funny, I took photos because I was like, I know this is going to be a little awkward. But I'll come in from, so me and my laptop friend. So this is the entrance of the studio. I've been trying, I'm a pretty organized person usually, but things end up getting like a little chaotic from time to time. I'm also working on a new piece on the floor.
Oh, nice. What is that going to be?
No, I don't know yet.
Okay, yeah.
I just started painting.
Yeah, no,
we'll see what happens.
Yeah, because you also touch on like how you started using color like intuitively. And I see that your process is a lot of that, of like building on intuition and building on like things that happen to make art happen. And one of those was community. Do you want to talk about the role of community in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think my goal in the studio is always to surprise myself or learn something that I didn't know. So I never go in thinking, oh, I'm going to make this thing, knowing what it'll look like at the end. I go in not knowing anything and hoping for the best. And I kind of feel like because of that, both like material help from people, but also just conversations are invaluable, because I end up sort of getting a spark of an idea or like an influence or something that kind of becomes a seed that I bring into the studio. So I think if I kind of tried to isolate myself and become a bit more insular in my work, things would get stagnant and stuck very quick. And it's all those like fresh ideas that come from people that really propel my work forward.
Nice. Thank you. We have a question from Lisa, and I'm going to read it out loud, but you can also see it on the chat panel. So it says, Kyla, congratulations on being our Emily Carr Studio Award winner this year. Congratulations. I am thinking of how movement was implied in your previous works, and now with the suspended works, there is actual movement taking place. And is there any relation to your feelings about movement in these pieces? And also, do you feel your knowledge of movement as a puppeteer specifically informs these works?
Yeah, I would say so I think there was something in the previous work that I was trying to do. I really love, lightness and movement, but what I've been searching for since I stopped doing puppetry and moved into visual art was to create objects that were kind of self-contained in a way, where like the movement and animation was in them. It didn't rely on me. And it wasn't like the object was dead until I touched it, because that's kind of how it feels with puppets. People after performing the show, we'd go and talk to the audience and they'd always say, oh, you must love hanging out with your puppets after the show. And we'd all be like, no, they're just fools. But with the sculptures, actually, I do feel like they have their own energy. Like it doesn't feel like they rely on me. And so that's what I was searching for in the previous work. And this feels to me right now like a more, and I say this word not as like a value judgment, but just they're more resonant or like a more successful way of expressing that sort of like movement and lightness and allowing them to be, I think the previous work was pretty goofy and like humorous, and that's still there with these to a certain extent, but they're also more, they're not hiding behind humor. They are humorous, but they're also just what they are, which I think is quite beautiful. And like I'm able to kind of sit with that, with the desire to make something beautiful out of things that are complicated.
Nice. And now that you have, because right now you're at Griffin and you have the space to like experiment and like work with all these different materials. So like, what's the next step once you move out of the studio?
So I'm showing a little bit of work at August Studios, which is in Sţwx in September. And then I'm doing a residency in Iceland in October, which is really exciting. And I think this way of working, I'm excited to explore it a bit more, because also I'd been thinking about Iceland and being like, and it's kind of outside of Reykjavik, and I was like, how am I going to get materials there? It's going to be so stressful. And now like working a bit lighter feels more exciting and more, I can kind of move things around and play and just be in the studio. I don't need to constantly be going out to scavenge.
Yeah. Great. We have a question from Andrew Booth. You can see it on the Q&A panel. So it says, love your practice, Kyla. Curious to hear your thought process on what types of found materials and objects you gravitate towards.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. It really changes, but I like, because I think there's a part of me that, again, really loves synthetics and things that are obviously fake. There's something I can show you. I have, like, my laptop case is one of those. I have a ton of fake marble. So like I'm really drawn to these like cheap junky things that are like really obviously silly and tacky, but really compelling at the same time. And then also I'm drawn to things that have been really worn. And so a lot of like old wood that's been weathered, or like concrete that's been split apart. But I think when I use those things, I don't want to leave them just like rusted or weathered. I want to kind of counteract that with by placing them in a context where they are somehow then like made clean, or like, that's the wrong word, but like I'm not just like, oh, it's rusty, but like what happens when I cover a rusty piece of metal in bright spray paint, and so you're seeing it as if it's a new thing, but it's actually a very old thing. Yeah, kind of like contradictions.
Nice, thank you. A follow-up from Lisa. She says, thank you, Kyla, so interesting and so exciting to hear about these upcoming residencies. One question on these current works. Can you tell us a bit more about your incursion / movement into painting with these works as well?
Yeah, I think I'm really drawn to painting, and a lot of the inspirations that I was finding were either painters or sculptors who use painting in their work. And I think it's partly because with sculpture, form and color are so intimately tied together. Like there is kind of more of an idea of the material is what it is. And so, you find the material, you make something with it, but you kind of need to let it be what it is. Whereas with painting, form is made by color. And I don't have a background in painting at all. So that's why I've been working pretty intuitively, because that's all I can do. But it's been really exciting. Again, it feels like rule breaking to me. So the sculptures that I was making with no color were way more restrained. Like I felt kind of tied to what I had. And so with each further step, I kind of break away from that more and let myself, or give myself the freedom to really just kind of explode out and try combining things that seem like they shouldn't go together. And that's again how I find the surprising things, or like the things that really do feel new or exciting, or like like combining two ideas that you didn't know could kind of help each other grow.
Yeah, that's very nice. So from Ati Girl, we have one of your sculptures reminds me of some of the mobile figures that Calder used with his mobile sculptures over the years. Have you thought of making some mobiles using your ideas for such a sculpture movement?
Like self-propelling mobiles. I think I could. Yeah, I've been using the mobiles that I've been making don't use physics. Same way. They just kind of are what they are. And so they still do move, but but I think that would be really exciting. I think I would need to, and that's something, maybe that can be an Iceland thing, doing more research on physics. A way to counteracts.
Yeah. And I really love how like movement is implicit within like your own making and your methodology of like you coming to Griffin, like using your bike. So like you're always in motion too.
Yeah, that's what it feels like. And there's all this color. Like today I was biking from the sea bus, and that route along the water is like so beautiful, and there's like so much color, and then like the floating homes and people biking by, and it's a lot of like
no, that sounds, it sounds like you've been having a good time.
I really have. I really like North Van.
That's lovely. Is there anything else you would like to share with us today?
I'm trying to think, what do I have around? I think, I highly recommend. I also got all these postcards from Urban Repurpose to put in the window. Anyone who hasn't been there, you should definitely go.
I'll get the details from you later. Sounds like a great place. Excellent. Well, seeing we don't have any other questions, I think we're gonna wrap up, but not without thanking you once more for all the work you have put into your residency and for sharing that with us today. So thank you everyone for joining us here today live from the studio with Kyla Gilbert. We hope to see you at our next event, live from the studio with James Harry. You can register using this link that I will post in the chat box for everyone. Everyone there. And also a reminder that these are the last weeks to see our current exhibition for the Garment Store collection. We're open Friday through Sunday, noon to 5 p.m. If you would like to know more about Griffin art projects, you can also subscribe to our newsletter, which is right at the bottom of our website, which I'm also sharing on the chat. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kyla.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Fanny.
Okay.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yes. Okay.